tell you that the Director of Land Use and Transportation, Andrew Singalakis, couldn't be here today, and regrets that fact. I also want to point out Stephen Roberts, who is my boss in the back of the room, in case you don't like what I'm saying. So, talk to him. Let me talk a little bit about the purpose of the development forum. So we have these things up here that state why we're here, but let me read them to you. So the first reason is to share information about development-related services and initiatives. The second is to hear and learn from our customers and how we can better support your needs. And the third, and to me the most important, is to build productive relationships between staff and customers. I say this every time, but we know that when you actually have a project and you're trying to figure out how to get approval for it, that having a prior relationship with you is really important. So we don't think that necessarily developing that relationship while you're in the midst of getting your permits is the best way to do it. Often that's the only way to do it, but having the ability to talk with you in a different form, I think, makes that process go a little bit smoother. Let me talk a little bit about activity and staff updates. I don't have a ton of information, but since last year, we keep track of a variety of different variables that sort of indicate how things are. But to me, maybe the best indicator is just permit fee revenue. So both on the current planning side and the building side, things are down about 20% from where they were last year. That's not necessarily a direct correlation to activity level, but it is an indicator that things have slowed down a little bit. Also, historically, every 6 months, I've announced some major change to staff that you'll be dealing with. I really don't have an update on that since 6 months ago, that most of the key staff that were here 6 months ago are still here. We've had a few little changes, but most of the people you'll be dealing with are still here, and we haven't gotten any indication that they're leaving soon. Let me read something that I call The Nature of Our Work, which I read every time. It's sort of the Development Forum Pledge of Allegiance, if you will. There's about 230 words here, and all of them are the same from last time except for two. So when I'm done, I'll point out the 2 words that I've added. So here I go. I'm going to read this. The nature of our work is to be your partner to get you through the process and meet regulations. It's important to note that we are regulators. We are here because development code and building codes are on the books and is law. It's a partnership with you, but also with our citizens who expect us to implement these regulations. When you are at the point of getting permits, it's not a productive debate whether or not they should be on the books, nor do we debate neighbors who want more regulations. Our job is to be your partner to get you through the regulations and procedures. I know the term regulator may have a bad connotation for some of you, but to me it means we are your partner to get you through the process to meet the regulations, not exceed the regulations nor waive the regulations. It's important to emphasize the partnership, but it's also important to recognize the fundamental truth that we wouldn't be here if these regulations weren't on the books. So what I added was the words and procedures, that we know that sometimes you can understand the specific standard you're trying to meet, but trying to get from A to B through our permit process can often be a little confusing. So we know that that's really important for us to clarify and hold your hand if your hand needs to be held. So that's what I added this time. So with that, the agenda this time is pretty simple. It's the Damon Rice show for the most part from Cleaner Water Services. We will have some information about the long-range planning work program near the end, but We know that the new design and construction standards are something that a lot of people are very interested in. So if Damon ends up taking the whole time, you certainly won't hear me complaining. So with that, I'll turn it over to Damon, and he'll go for a half an hour or so, hopefully.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Damon Reishi with Clean Water Services. I'm the Planning and Development Services Division Manager, and I'm expecting that many of you are here today to hear about the Design and Construction Standards update, and that update has to do with hydromodification. And for those of you that maybe came to our public meeting back in February, I believe it was. Some of this may be a repeat, but some things have happened since then. Our board has actually, on April 2nd, adopted the new standards. We're also moving forward, already anticipating a potential update to the standards in the fall, much more minor update to the standards, but may incorporate some changes to the hydromodification standards that we just adopted. Talk a little bit about that today. But I really like to start, well, first I'll ask, how many of you came today to hear about the new design and construction standards? That was your reason? Oh, see, it isn't just about me. Can everybody hear me okay? Don't really like to stand behind the podium. So I like to begin with, what is hydromodification? Who knows what hydromodification is? I always like to get a sense of who in the audience has a feel for that. You're just not raising your hands because you've seen me play this trick on people before where I call on you. I'll explain what hydromodification is. Hydromodification is actually pretty simple. It's just a complicated word for the change in runoff that occurs when there's a change to the landscape. When we talk about it with regard to development, we're really talking about that change from being a pervious surface with vegetation on it to an impervious surface where there's development. And what occurs as a result is you have more runoff and faster runoff as a result of that impervious area. That can do different things. One of the things that's talked about a lot with hydromodification is increased flooding downstream. Oh, because you want to record, huh? All right, well, maybe we can do that. So that increase in runoff can cause flooding. That flooding is one of the things a lot of property owners worry about with hydromodification. Another thing that occurs is downcutting or erosion of the stream channel, and that's what these pictures demonstrate or show here. That can be a threat to infrastructure like sewer lines that might be crossing under that creek, and of course we don't want those exposed where they might break and start to leak into a stream. But that erosion actually is a water quality issue as well for the fisheries downstream. And we were required to update our permit, or our permit was updated, and we were required to have standards to address hydromodification really with an eye towards that water quality component. So in 2016, we got a new watershed-based National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems permit, or an NPDES permit, issued by DEQ. It is a federal permit under the Clean Water Act. It covers 5 discharges that happen in urban Washington County that Clean Water Services is responsible for. 4 of those discharges are from our treatment plants. The 5th discharge is from the Municipal Storm Separate Sewer System, or the MS4 system, and that's all the various stormwater discharges that come out of our storm pipes into creek systems. This new permit that we received in 2016 on April 22nd of 2016, had a requirement for us to do many, many things, but there were three things that necessitated updating our design and construction standards. The first two things we did on April 22nd of 2017. That was the first anniversary of the permit. And the triggers for when we had to have these things done were on the permit anniversaries. So the first two were the 1,000 square foot treatment threshold for stormwater management. We had had lower thresholds for certain types of development in the past, but for single-family homeowner type projects and very small partition type developments, there wasn't actually a treatment requirement or a threshold that they were triggered by. So that got added in 2017. We also had a requirement to prioritize low-impact development approaches. This is something we've been doing in Washington County for a very long time. We've had vegetated water quality facilities, and those really are low-impact development approaches. If you go elsewhere in the country, they're just now starting to really talk about these facilities as being sort of this new thing that they need to do, and we've had them for over 20 years. So then the second phase of our update, which is what will go into effect on Monday, April 22nd, was to implement a hydromodification plan, and part of that plan is to have development standards or development requirements to address hydromodification. This is just a little snippet from the permit, but wanted to emphasize one thing is that it really had pushed us to optimize on-site retention based on the site conditions of the project. And what that's getting at is really wanting to try to deal with those runoff issues on-site or really before it gets to the stream. Our approach to hydromodification that we initially proposed is a little bit different than that, but still in keeping with it. What we've talked about now since 2016 is wanting to implement a sub-basin approach or a regional approach to addressing hydromodification. And a very typical way of tackling hydromodification is just to do upland ponds on each site. While that does a fairly good job of preventing additional impacts from occurring, what it doesn't do is address degradation that's happened to the stream channel over time. So we came up with this thought of how can we do stream enhancement to protect the streams, make them more resilient to these new flows in combination with upland controls. We've piloted that in North Bethany, which we consider a sub-basin planned area. And if you're familiar with North Bethany and sort of what's happened with the stormwater management up there is you have a lot of low-impact development approaches, these street-side planters or planters that are inside a subdivision or in some cases on individual properties that are geared toward addressing water quality, but they also provide a little bit of flow attenuation or slow down how quickly things run off. Then we have upland regional ponds that various neighborhoods drain to, and there's probably somewhere on the order of a dozen of those throughout North Bethany. And then we've also done stream enhancement projects. So our goal was to use a combination of those tools to address both water quality and the stormwater volume management or hydromodification. What we learned from North Bethany is that it is very complicated, difficult, and time-consuming to both develop a sub-basin strategy and to implement it. We're still very committed to that, but we weren't going to be able to come up with sub-basin strategies for the entire district by April 22nd of this year. So what we proposed to do in order to meet our permit requirement was to implement what we called the base strategy to address hydromodification. This is very similar to strategies you see in other jurisdictions around the Portland metropolitan area. And it's intended to be an interim step. This is a placeholder as we develop sub-basin strategies. And as we develop sub-basin strategies, areas will switch from having to use the base strategy to then plugging into whatever the regional approach is for that particular sub-basin. One thing I want to say about before I get into more of the detail about the base strategy, one of the things that rolled out just prior to the base strategy in November was an implementation policy. And the implementation policy was really intended to attempt to give development a little bit of certainty about the projects that were already in process. We recognized that hydromodification standards were going to be a big change over what we already had and could impact projects more on a scale that land use decisions typically affect projects as opposed to engineering requirements. With that change, we wanted to make sure that projects that maybe were already developing plans to make submittal to land use before our standards went into effect would have some assurance that they weren't going to have to go back and start land use over. So we went around and we talked to the various land use jurisdictions that are within our service district and basically came up with a threshold that's a little different than what we've done in the past with the design and construction standards. And we, rather than tying to when you submitted your engineering plans, we tied it to when you make land use application. So for projects that make land use application prior to April 22nd of this year, so prior to this coming Monday, those projects would continue to be under our current standards, Resolution and Order 17-5, that do not currently require hydromodification. For projects that require land use, if you submit on the 22nd or after, then the new standards, Resolution and Order 19-5, with the hydromodification requirement will apply to your project. So for a little while, we're going to be working under two sets of standards. For projects that don't require land use, we wanted to give a similar type of buffer in time to, or opportunity for people to sort of get up to speed with the new standard. So our board went with a 180-day grace period for those projects not requiring land use. This is probably going to be a lot more of those small homeowner type projects where somebody for the summer has decided that they want to do an addition. Any questions about the implementation policy before I move on? I know that that's something that folks frequently have a lot of questions about. Okay. So under our base strategy, we started thinking about how people could figure out sort of what they needed to do. And, well, I guess before I get there, I should say, really we were focused very much on hydromodification and not changing a lot of the design and construction standards, because again, recognizing that hydromodification on its own was a pretty big change and we didn't want to confuse the issue, and we had a pretty tight timeline. So things that changed in the design and construction standards or will be new on April 22nd is primarily in Chapter 4. We did some reorganization of Chapter 4, but with regard to additions, It's mostly about hydromodification. Water quality requirements haven't really changed. Downstream, having to do an analysis downstream to look at conveyance capacity of pipes hasn't really changed. They may have moved around a bit. We've changed some language. You'll see that we've gone to using stormwater management or stormwater management approaches as opposed to facilities a lot more. We've added some additional approaches or BMPs to manage stormwater, but we haven't really taken anything away that was already there or changed that. We also needed to make some changes to Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, where we had definitions that applied to Chapter 4 and submittal requirements for engineering plan review. And that's really what changed in Chapter 1 and 2. Big changes, again, are Chapter 4. So the base strategy concept, you kind of got to figure out three basic things. And what you have to do is based on these three things. One is your project size category. So the thought is the bigger the project, the larger its impact is likely to be on the stream. There's also development class, which is, are you in an urban area that's mostly developed already versus are you in more of an expansion or greenfield type area where there hasn't been much development? And again, you would expect to, in general, see that streams have already been more impacted in areas that have been developed as opposed to those areas that are just now newly developing. And then there's hydromodification risk level, and this is more of a focus on the stream channel that you're discharging to and sort of what its current status is and condition and how likely it is to be further impacted. So we created a map tool. I'll show a screenshot of here in a minute. But what you have to figure out in order to use this map tool, which initially is a pre-screening tool, but you've got to figure out where is your project, how much impervious area is planned. That lets you figure out your project size, and where does the project discharge into the stream so that you can look at that stream channel to see whether it is low, moderate, or high risk for hydromodification impacts. This is just a screenshot zoomed in of an area of the tool, and it doesn't even show all the information that's available on the tool. But what you can kind of clearly see on this is that there's three colors along the stream areas. And I apologize to the people that are in the way back. I'd point at one of these other screens, but the dots don't work on the video monitors. But what we have are these blue streams that have sort of highlighted green, yellow, and red. Green is the low risk areas, yellow is moderate, and red is high. What you do is you find your project on this map, and then you trace through the storm system. You can't see the storm pipes at this scale, but if you were to zoom in closer, those are available. You trace through the storm system to figure out where you're discharging into the creek. And then you need to look a quarter mile downstream from where you discharge into the creek. And whatever your highest risk level is the risk level you apply to your project. So knowing the risk level to the stream, the amount of impervious area modified or created, and then whether or not you're in a developed area or expansion area. And you can see an example of the expansion area is that crosshatched area on the left is an expansion. I believe that's South Hillsborough. If you have those three pieces of information, you can get a good idea of what category you're going to be in. So you go to this table, and this is right out of the design and construction standards. And at the top, you can see you've got your impervious area sizes, and those categories, 1,000 to 12,000 is small, 12,000 to 80,000 square feet is medium, and above 80,000 square feet is a large project. And then on the left-hand side, you have a combination of whether you're in an expansion or developed area, along with what is the risk level to the stream, low, moderate, or high. So as you can see, for small projects, it doesn't really matter what category you are or what the situation with the stream is on the left. You're going to be category 1. And that's because we recognize a lot of small projects. It would be onerous to do this study. Medium projects that are essentially low or moderate risk and more on the side of being in developed areas are in category 2. And then when you're sort of in those highest risk areas, you're category 3. Now, I'll give a quick summary here of what those categories look like. So category 1, you get a choice between doing infiltration LIDA, and there's an option to do a simplified sizing method, which is just a 12% facility size based on your impervious area. So 12% of your impervious area is what your facility size is, much like we do for LIDAs on water quality with 6%. Or you can choose to pay the hydromodification fee in lieu. And I suspect most folks are going to go with the fee in lieu in this case. However, we thought there might be some homeowners that would be interested in doing a rain garden or a planter on their property, and we wanted to make sure that we left that option available to them. For category 2, so this is for projects that are over 12,000 square feet, you're required to use a combination of detention and infiltration LIDA. So that can be anywhere from entirely infiltration LIDA to entirely using a pond to some combination of the two. Doesn't matter. But what does matter is getting to a point where your post-development runoff for the 2, the 5, and the 10-year peak storms, those peaks are matched to the pre-development runoff of the half the 2-year, the 5, and the 10 respectively. One important thing to note about what that pre-development condition is it's prior to making your land use application. So some jurisdictions actually talk about Lewis and Clark or a site that is 80% forested. We're really looking at what was the condition of that property before you started to move into development with it. Category 3, you have to do the same thing you have to do for category 2, match those peaks, but it has the additional requirement that 30% of the site runoff has to be managed with LIDA. Now, that's not to say it has to be infiltration LIDA. It may be LIDA that just addresses water quality, but 30% of the impervious area needs to be managed with low-impact development approaches. Questions on that? I know that's a lot. Okay. One of the other changes to the standards that is significant, and really this is in addition, is we added a number of various approaches to both address water quality and hydromodification. And this table from the standards is really just a summary of all those different stormwater management approaches on the left. And then across the top, it covers what those different approaches might address so that you can quickly sort of look up and understand whether it's applicable to hydromodification, water quality, conveyance capacity, whether it can be a public facility or a private facility. So this kind of summarizes those different those different threshold breaks for the small, medium, and large, and brings in another concept here. So to explain what you're seeing a little bit on this graph, this is an analysis that we did looking at Hillsborough data and unincorporated Washington County data for development. And what you have across the bottom is the amount of impervious area created by individual projects. And then you've got on the left the total or the cumulative percent of total impervious area as a result of those projects. So one thing I'll point out that's a little bit strange about this graph compared to what you most typically see is the x-axis on the bottom actually runs from a larger number to a smaller number. So it goes from 120,000 square feet to 0 on the right. So in that sort of pinkish color, you've got large projects, and you'll notice that over on the far left, somewhere between 110,000 and 120,000 square feet is what the very largest projects generated in terms of new impervious area. And that was about 60% of the total impervious area created in those in Hillsborough and unincorporated Washington County at that time. So as you move towards the right and that break at 80,000 square feet, somewhere around 72% of the impervious area being created was from projects that were 80,000 square feet and larger. That medium category from the 12,000 square feet to 80,000 square feet is that next section. And when you add that up with the large projects, you're getting somewhere in between 85 and 90% of all the impervious area being created. And then finally, the small category is that last maybe 7 to 8% of impervious area being generated. So when we think about those categories and size breaks, that small green area is the area where applicants have the choice to either do fee in lieu or do some sort of on-site facility. That large blue area, not the hatched blue area, that goes from 12 to 80,000 square feet is that category 2 area where you're having to do the peak matching. And then finally, the pink area, the large, is that peak matching with the additional 30% management by low-impact development approaches. Now, this hatched area that's in between 12,000 square feet and 25,000 square feet was sort of a late addition to our proposed standards. And what that was trying to get at, was allowing for fee in lieu in some additional situations. And this fee in lieu isn't merely an option, but requires a little bit of analysis. And what we recognized is that there are projects that are maybe more in those developed areas where the risk to the drainage is less, it's not high, and most of the contributing basin is built out, and the project is small enough that its runoff is a pretty small portion of the runoff at the point, or the flow of the stream at the point that it's discharging. So we wanted to basically do an analysis to figure out where those areas were, but we weren't going to be able to complete that by April 22nd. We're continuing to work on that. However, we wanted to sort of have something for those projects moving forward ahead of us to have some criteria for when they might fall into this fee in lieu strategy. So it's for projects that are less than 25,000 square feet. When the risk level to the stream is not high, so it's not that red color, it's either the green or the yellow on the map. The discharge from the project is less than 10% of the total tributary drainage flow at the creek at the point you're discharging, and the contributing drainage basin has less than 10% developable area left to it. And there's been some additional language added to sort of indicate what sorts of parcels you might remove when doing that analysis. Things like cemeteries, while they may be pervious and could be turned impervious as a result of development, they're not terribly likely to develop. So those wouldn't be counted in the analysis. Those areas would also be able to do a fee in lieu as opposed to having to do something on site to address hydromodification. And I just want to mention that while these fee in lieus that we're discussing here are specific to hydromodification, water quality will still be required on site in the same way it has been for years. So we haven't made any changes to that. While the new standards did not adopt a rate for hydromodification fee in lieu, we are working on developing that, and we'll need to include something in our update to rates and charges, which will go before the board in June. This is typical. We every year update rates and charges around this time of year and take it to the board in June, and it is effective on July 1st. We started out looking at these hydromod fee in lieu categories. We did a bit of an analysis looking across the board at different types of projects that could be used to manage stormwater and hydromodification. So we looked at a full range of everything from sort of that on-site water quality, quantity, planter box or rain garden, to detention ponds, to stream enhancement projects. And that's quite a range when you start to break it down to a per square foot area managed. The other thing that we saw is even when you look within a particular class, say a detention pond, you can get a very broad range of different unit costs based on just the topography of the site. So what we did was we attempted to take something that was in the middle, maybe skewing a little bit towards the smaller side, recognizing that the way the standards are right now, it's more small projects and maybe homeowners in particular that would be taking advantage of fee in lieu. And we came up with a proposed rate. And there's a fact sheet on our website that discusses this in a little bit more detail. But essentially what it is, if you are needing, or if you're paying both water quality and a hydromodification fee in lieu, it would be $1.50 per square foot of managed impervious area. If you're only paying for water quality or you're only paying for hydromodification, it's $1 per square foot of managed impervious area, or that's what we're proposing. The reason for not going to $2 is we recognize that there's some nesting ability or that there's some co-management of both quality and quantity in each of those facilities. So that's why there's a little bit of a break on the overall cost when managing both quality and hydromodification. So now that we have adopted standards that go into effect on Monday, sort of what's next? And we're working on getting a finalized website that'll be active either today or tomorrow, and having a clean version of the new design and construction standards posted on that. You can see the adopted design and construction standards with its red line markups currently on our website if you're if you want to look at it sooner, but the clean version will be available by the end of the week. Also available on the website and continuing to be available on the website will be that hydromodification web map tool. We do anticipate that we're going to do training for the development community. Probably we're looking at June 25th right now. So watch your emails for that. We will send that out to the same listserv that we have been doing for the design and construction standards update. That training is likely to be sort of a half-day kind of thing. And I think we're going to do it by registration. We're going to ask people to register so that we make sure that we have enough space. And if we get more interest than we have space for, we'll do a second training. During the discussion with the board, there was a lot of discussion around that middle-sized set of projects and how the on-site hydromodification requirements could be minimized in order to essentially preserve developable space, buildable space. And so the board asked us to come back to them with sort of how we might tackle moving forward with looking at that specific issue. They recognized that we needed to adopt the standards that they did adopt by our due date for DEQ, but wanted to look at this particular issue a little bit further. We also knew we had some additional updates to the standards that we needed to do. In particular, we're doing some updates to pump station requirements. So on Tuesday, we went back to the board during work session and talked with them about a scope and schedule for these additional updates. So what we're talking about doing is updating the standards in fall. We know that we don't want to open the standards a whole bunch of times. Fall is pretty soon yet again, but we want to try to tackle the various pieces that we have in one shot. So we're going to update Chapter 9. I think for the most part that will have very limited effects on the development community because most developments don't build pump stations. Most of those are built by the district. There are a few exceptions to that. We also need to update our design details. We will be rolling some out probably prior to fall as guidance, but with these changes, we really just didn't have time to update the details, either to address hydromodification or other things that when we updated in 2017, we missed or mistakenly got in there. We want to be able to incorporate refinements based on, as we start to implement these hydromodification standards, we expect that we'll discover things that were not intended or maybe were intended but aren't working. So it's an opportunity to correct those at that time. We also had to submit a hydromodification assessment report to DEQ, and we just got the letter back on Monday afternoon. They asked some questions. We're still evaluating whether or not any of those questions would result in us needing to modify anything in the design standards. I think that it's unlikely or that they would be very minor changes. That assessment report didn't really get into the specifics of what's in the design and construction standards. It was a much higher level approach and talked a lot about our sub-basin strategy approach to addressing hydromodification throughout the district. And then finally, this last piece is the piece that the board had requested that we look into a little further for exploring refinements for on-site alternatives. So that might take the form of the regional stormwater management projects in infill areas, sort of what the different fee in lieu program components could be, maybe looking at expanding beyond this basic fee in lieu proposal that we have of the $1.50, and then what opportunities there might be for some sort of on-site regional combination that would allow for maybe not elimination of an on-site approach, but a reduction in size of an on-site approach. So we're at the very early stages. At the work session, the board did direct us to move forward with this. Part of what we told them we would do is consider these criteria for this fall amendment, and that is to think about the NPDES permit requirements and make sure that we're consistent with what we've told them in the hydromodification assessment report. We need to make sure that we're defensible in any changes from an economic, legal, and regulatory perspective. We also want to consider site, regional, and programmatic approaches as potential solutions. Of course, we're going to think about the increased protection and enhancement of natural resources, as that's really the purpose behind these standards or hydromodification standards. This update technical specifications for consistency with industry standards is really focused at that Chapter 9 pump station piece. And then we want standards that are easily implementable across all of our jurisdictions. So Clean Water Services isn't the only jurisdiction that implements these standards. There's our 7 co-implementing larger cities in Washington County that also implement these standards. So we need to make sure that they work with those jurisdictions as well. And then we'll also look at updating rates and charges in the fall, if applicable, as a result of what we might do with any change to the design and construction standards. So this is the schedule that we showed to our board. It is very high level. It starts out on the left with a work session this past Tuesday. We suggested that they continue the charge to the Clean Water Advisory Commission that they appoint to act as a sounding board. You'll notice that there are several meetings with CWAC, CWAC, Clean Water Advisory Commission, that will play a role in sort of that public forum. We are updating rates and charges in June. We're scheduled to go to the board on June 18th. However, that would become effective on July 1st. The board has requested that we take them on a tour so that they can see a variety of different stormwater management approaches throughout the district. We've got some tentative public notice and work session and public hearing dates on the schedule. You'll notice that the pink line at the timeline at the bottom sort of considers what a project making application under the new standards, what their timeline for land use might look like. And our thought is that most projects would be getting land use approval in a similar time frame to when we might make these changes. And the reason that that's important is that we wanted to have the opportunity that if we make changes to the standards that would benefit a project, that they could take advantage of those changes. So if it did mean a reduction in an on-site approach, that there may still be a chance for them to incorporate that into their engineering design and gain lots back. We've had some discussions and are continuing to have discussions with different land use authorities to figure out how that might work, because I know frequently adding lots back to a subdivision can do a lot to reset land use, but it seems that there may be some ways of tackling that depending on the jurisdiction, so that you're not having to go back to square one in order to take advantage of engineering changes that might come out of these standards. All right, can't see a clock. I'm probably over. Okay. Any quick questions? You said you'd give me the whole time.
So you guys done any forecasting on the amount of revenues you generate from your fees?
No, we really haven't done that. We don't have a good sense of how many projects will go to fee in lieu at this point. What I can say is that the cost of building regional solutions, especially for already developed areas, likely wouldn't be able to be covered by that $1.50 a square foot generated from new development activity or even redevelopment activity.
So that's what you plan on doing with fee in lieu, building regional facilities?
Regional facilities or in-stream stormwater management approaches. So the sub-basin strategy has a component known as Regional Stormwater Management Charge, or RSMC, that we've implemented in North Bethany. And that is really set up to work as a way to pay back those regional approaches that are done. Fee in lieu might need to work a little different, but could have a component that was similar that could fund projects. Ultimately, fee in lieu does need to go back towards addressing the impact that it was collected to cover under that our permit requires that. So, but that money could be used in combination with other money. Yes.
So for the little guy, 2-3 lot partition, it sounds like fee in lieu is going to be a much cheaper option.
That could be, yeah.
And is it $26.40 per lot?
Yeah, so I didn't get into all the details of that. There was a change about how that worked. 2640 or 2,640 square feet is our base equivalent storm unit that we use for both billing but also sizing facilities for the individual lots. We use actual impervious for things like streets or commercial developments. We did make a change that allows for when projects have smaller sized lots up to 3,000 square foot lot to then use a formula that's close to using actual impervious as a way of sizing those facilities. So say you have a lot that's 2,800 square feet and your maximum potential buildable area on it is only 2,300 square feet, you would be able to use 2,300 square feet as opposed to 2,640. Yes?
Where the groundwater is pretty high in a lot of parts of the county, especially in development and trade, you can pass these detention tanks. Is that not really an option?
Detention is allowed in some situations under the new standards. It is akin to where we've allowed proprietary filter vaults. So commercial developments that are a single lot or maybe a shared parking where that facility will be private, it is allowed. It's allowed in public situations that are more transit oriented, so high density type situations, or where it is a regional facility. So it's got that same set of criteria as the water quality. We wanted to sort of dip our toe into the water a little bit with that. We will continue to evaluate whether that strategy can be used more broadly, but because we don't have a lot of underground detention facilities, and those that we have had throughout the district have had some problems with maintenance, we sort of wanted to ease into that. Yes?
In your analysis, did you do anything thinking this all the way back to looking at what its impact that the new requirements are going to have as far as meeting minimum density standards, housing type, and or affordability of that?
Not so much the affordability piece. We did look at how some of the thresholds worked with zoning and considered that. We were really trying to get the vast majority of partitions, 3 lots and less, within that smaller category. Okay,
Okay.
thank you. And again, remember there'll be an opportunity for a public training probably around June 25th, and we can get into more detailed questions. Thanks.
So I'm going to, in the interest of allowing you to eat as many bagels as possible, go through this pretty quickly. So this is about the long-range planning work program. So briefly what that is, in planning development services, there are 3 main sections: building, current planning, and long-range planning. So building and current planning, their work program is a function of customers. So answering questions at the counter and as permits come in. So they don't have a ton of discretion in terms of their work program. Long-range planning does have a lot of discretion. So we have this process set up where we work with the board and the community to develop what types of ordinances and other things they want long-range planning to work on. So essentially this lays out the schedule, and the board adopted a new work program on March 26th. So long-range planning has 2 main sections: community planning, which is essentially a land use planning, so wherever the county has land use jurisdiction, not the cities, and transportation planning, which can cover the cities also, as Washington County has roads in the cities of Washington County. Generally, we have more work requested of us than people, and so because of that, we have to go through this exercise to figure out how we're going to prioritize the work. So if something shows up as a Tier 1 task, there's a commitment to do it. Tier 2 are things that are committed to, that they're worth doing, but we just don't have the resources to do it, and other things are a priority. In Tier 3, if something ends up in Tier 3, it's likely not going to happen anytime soon. So in Tier 1, we ended up with 26 tasks. Some of the things are ongoing, things like plan amendments. Somebody shows up and requests a plan amendment, we process that application. If you want an annexation, we process the annexation. So a lot of regional, state, federal coordination done with long-range planning. They spend a lot of time at Metro and ODOT trying to make sure that we're doing things in a similar fashion. And then within comprehensive planning, there's short-term projects, and then there's a lot of things that take 2 or 3 or 4 years sometimes. So here are sort of the highlights of the community planning ordinances that are going to be worked on this next year. Baker Rock Quarry is expanding, so if you're near Baker Rock Quarry, that's a big deal for you. If you're not, it's something that might not be on your radar. We continue to work on a lot of affordable housing issues, changing the code to make things easier, so that can include things like we're looking at cluster housing as a potential new ordinance, and some other things with accessory dwelling units. telecommunications facilities in the right-of-way that has to do with 5G is coming down the pike, and I never really understood what that saying meant. But anyway, a lot of the new small cells will end up being in the right-of-way, and so we have to figure out how we're going to accommodate them. The ALOA plan designations is essentially an ALOA town center plan for the area around 185th and TV Highway, to make it a more pedestrian-oriented area going forward. We've had a lot of comments about significant natural resources. We may end up with an ordinance on that this year. We're doing some work on centers and corridors, which is essentially in 2040, there's a focus on putting more density in those places. So this is just an analysis of those areas to see if we can accommodate more things. Short-term rentals, the county currently doesn't have any ordinance in place if you have an Airbnb or VRBO. So we've gotten some complaints from neighbors who live next to those. Marijuana regulations, it's been up for a couple years. This is essentially just a status report to look at that and see if there's any changes we need to do. Omnibus is kind of a catch-all ordinance we do every year for things that are sort of not major, but definitely require their own specific look. Erin Wardell, raise your hand. I'm not going to bring her up here in the interest of bagel eating quickness, but here are the transportation planning ordinances and highlights that the transportation planning section. The one thing I am going to point out that is going to impact the development community is we're taking a new look at our road design and construction standards. So this is also, clearly something that the county engineer will work on with transportation planning, but that could result in different standards for different roads. So that's something we can certainly get to you in terms of more information. But Erin's here if any of these things go, oh, what does that mean? So feel free to tackle her after I'm done here. That's all we have on that. I do want to highlight a couple of other things before we jump into just networking. One is, so the county has set up 2 new divisions in the county engineering capital project group. So before it was just under one county engineer. So we're setting up 2 new divisions for those of you who deal with our folks at Walnut Street. So the new capital project manager and county engineer are, I'm not going to say it because we're a couple weeks or less before releasing that information, but know that there's a little reorganization going over there. Another thing I do want to mention, and again, I'm going to be somewhat secretive about this, is we've been working for the past couple of years developing a new permitting system called Excella. So Permits Plus is on its way out, and Excella will be here hopefully within the next couple months. I'm not going to tell you the specific date we're shooting for because we don't want to tell you that and then not reach it. But we think we're 99% there. We have a date in the next couple of months we're shooting for. Once we're certain that we're going to implement it on that date, we'll let you know. It could cause some disruption for a couple of days as we transition over in terms of permit processing, but I think once it's up and running, it'll be a much better system and certainly allow you to stay better informed of where your permits are in the process. So with that, I'm done. Go eat. The amount of food that we order for the next development forum is a function of how much is consumed today, so just keep that in mind. I do want to point out a couple of people here just in case. So Scott Linfesty is our building official, and Tom Harry is the principal planner in current planning. So they're the 2 main permit guys. So have fun.